Blood Omen: Legacy of Kain is an adventure game developed by Silicon Knights and published by Crystal Dynamics in 1996. In many ways, while it on the surface seems an extremely traditional game, it still managed to subvert my expectations when I originally played it. And in this video, I hope to explain why. As you start the game, you're shown several separate company introduction videos highlighting the interesting relationship the Legacy of Kain intellectual property had at the time. Something that is likely worth its own video, made by someone else. After the videos, you see a stylistic but simple main menu, from whence you can either enter the options menu, watch a preview for a completely different game, or start the game. The options menu itself begins with a map of the world you're about to enter in, a dark chronicle which at this point does nothing, but can later be used to rewatch in-game cutscenes, the load game menu, and buttons to change the controls or adjust the volume of the music and other audio. Pressing the start button, you're immediately faced with an ominous quote before the scene switches to an apocalyptic scene of soldiers impaling people on massive spikes, showcasing the 3D rendered cutscenes of the game, before changing again to a monstrous-looking humanoid creature slaughtering people within some kind of a fortress or a keep, drinking their blood. The people scream for help, but it doesn't come until it's too late. This warrior, called Malek of the Sarafan, is then punished for his failure to protect the people, condemned to forever inhabit a suit of armor in spirit form and serve these people. We see yet another murder occur, and a vision of pristine white pillars which crack and turn black. Who were these people? What happened? What are the pillars? All of the imagery is provocative but explains a little for now. Our understanding of the scenes reflect the understanding of the character whose story we are about to play. Meet Kain, a nobleman from Korhagen on a journey, attempting to get service at a tavern on the road. But his requests are rebuffed, since the tavern keeper refuses to keep the place open at night during these dark times. This introduces us to one of the best parts of the game, Kain's narration, voiced brilliantly by Simon Templeman, who does an amazing job giving the character personality.
And so I left, cold of heart and soul, forced to the road and the long, bitter night.
The game itself is played from a top-down perspective, in a similar way to games such as some of the Legend of Zelda games, a comparison that is impossible to avoid with many aspects of the game. The graphics of the game aim for a more realistic look than the more traditional cartoony sprite work that is common in 2D video games. And while for the most part it looks quite good, in some instances it can be messy. Controlling Kain works pretty much as you'd expect, and they function rather well. Using directional controls, you can move in the 8 main directions, and pressing the attack button while facing a direction swings your sword in that direction, very, very slowly. Immediately after leaving the tavern, these controls come in handy, as you're ambushed by a band of marauders who are there clearly after you. No matter how well you learn these controls, eventually you'll succumb to the overwhelming number of enemies and you die. Since clearly Kain has not lived a godly life, he finds himself in hell. But not all is lost, as while Kain is lamenting his fate, the necromancer Mortanius arrives and gives him the opportunity to get revenge on those who murdered him. Still enraged, Kain quickly accepts this opportunity and is released from his bonds, but is changed. In this moment, the narration gives us one of the best lines to begin the game with, and a perfect way to set the foundations for some of the game's themes.
The necromancer Mortanius offered me a chance for vengeance, and like a fool, I jumped at his offer without considering the cost. Nothing is free, not even revenge.
You wake up to your new existence in a crypt. Enough time has clearly passed since your death that a funeral was arranged, and your corpse was buried deep within this elaborate mausoleum. And so begins the tutorial. The crypt takes the form of a linear sequence of rooms, each of them expecting the player to perform a specific action before unlocking the door to the next area. Unlike in many more modern games, however, the tutorial does not actually explain to you how to do things, or pause the game with a pop-up window to do so. Instead, the area merely takes the form of a simplistic dungeon while teaching you the basics of the game organically. To proceed from your sanctuary, you must push a button that unlocks the first door. Pushing a button isn't done with an action button, but instead by bumping into it within the game world. This button is conveniently lit up, and when you push it, the light disappears, showing you that the action has now been taken. Not only is this a clever way to visually show the player which actions they've already taken, it also showcases the somewhat dynamic lighting systems of the game, which amplify the, in my opinion, rather fantastic visuals of the game. In the next room, you find a large tarot card. This is how a vast majority of collectible items appear in the game. Spells, equipment, and items are shown in the game world as tarot cards with an image of the object or spell it contains. This spell is called Sanctuary, and using it allows you to abandon your current task and return back to the beginning of the game. Proceeding through the crypt one room at a time teaches you more and more features, such as how some objects are movable and need to be pushed, or how there are environmental hazards in the world. You can find blood and magic energy containers as well, which increase the amount of each that you can have at the time. This is a rather brilliant way to organically teach the player about different features of the game. The crypt also has rudimentary button puzzles, containers that can be opened for items, showcasing of transforming environments, and also different enemy types. Now that you have been turned into a vampire, your life depends on a steady supply of living blood. Killing an enemy will give you no blood, since drinking from a corpse does not sustain your vampiric unlife. This leads to one of the most interesting ways the game has made the combat just a little bit more difficult. When fighting humans, even in the introduction segment before your transformation, you may have noticed that after a few hits, the enemies get stunned for a moment, before falling to the ground dead. Hitting them with a sword while in this state immediately kills them. As a human, this meant nothing, but as a vampire, this is your opportunity. Only stunned enemies can be drunk from, which can create a dilemma. Sure, as a vampire, you now have faster combo attacks and can rather swiftly cut through most enemies you encounter at this point, but if you do, no damage you receive will be healed, since you let that blood go to waste. Yes, there are chained prisoners on the wall sometimes, and these people are practically free food, but there's no guarantee the game will provide this easy healing to you at every step. Will you fight enemies with more ferocity? Will you count your hits to maximize the amount of blood you can feed on? Or will you try to avoid confrontation altogether, since the game does not have an experience system, and the only things to gain from combat are more blood and a safer passage to wherever you're going? This is a thought process that, at least for me, remained in place for most of the game. The one big problem with combat is that, especially with melee enemies, they sometimes try to occupy the same space as you do, creating a situation where neither of you are actually hitting each other until you reposition. Fighting the skeletons in the crypt, however, will net you no blood. After all, they are skeletons, and striking them down will kill them immediately instead of stunning them. This shows the player what kinds of fighting dynamics they may encounter during the game. Humans can be dangerous, but they also have blood. Fighting them in a way that allows you to feed will keep you healed and safe. But there are also other types of enemies, ones that you cannot feed from, requiring you to find other sources of sustenance, or be much more careful in your approach. Despite the fighting in many ways being extremely simplistic, this relationship between the enemy types and your ability to heal ascends the combat system from being merely a button masher to something far more interesting. In the crypt, one of the items you can find is called a Heart of Darkness. This as well is an important part of the healing dynamic, a somewhat uncommon item that allows you to feast from its forever beating unlife, or in more mundane terms, basically a consumable healing potion. But that is not all the heart can do. Even to a vampire, death is a possibility. Your constantly draining blood reserve is an issue by itself, but combat with enemies or environmental hazards can drain that precious liquid from you even faster. If you run out of blood, that is the end of your journey, unless you have a Heart of Darkness in your inventory. As, in addition to being a consumable blood supply, the game automatically uses up one of your Hearts of Darkness in case of death, slightly recovering your health while saving you from the eternal slumber. This creates yet another brilliant dilemma on how to use and reserve your various blood supplies, as a quick heal might be useful if there are no other blood supplies around, but that also removes one extra life that might be useful later on. Fighting your way through the rest of the crypt, Kain's narration teaches you more about the nature of vampiric unlife in this universe. Sunlight to you is not immediately lethal, but it does weaken you. He also states rather ominously that as time passes, this will get worse. Time in the world of Nosgoth is constantly moving, and in the user interface you have a handy sundial which shows you the current time. While a dynamic day-night cycle is atmospheric and I like it, for the most part it doesn't really affect the gameplay in any meaningful way. You will also encounter vista markers. These are basically narration trigger points where Kain will comment on something related to the current location, such as explaining what save points are within the context of the universe of Nosgoth. Vista markers appear in two varieties, audio and visual. The audio markers merely play an audio clip, whereas a visual marker either opens a small window with an image of the object being viewed or shows a full-screen image of the viewed location. This may also be accompanied by an audio clip. These play automatically when first stepped on, but can be replayed by using the action button while on top of a marker. In some locations, this can be an issue, since the action button is also used to feed from enemies, and the Vista replay action overrides the feeding action. Saving can only be done at specific save points, which are thankfully placed at basically all important locations, and you are rarely unable to find one nearby. The process itself is quite self-explanatory. You open the save menu, choose a slot, and the game saves. Instead of being able to name the saves, the game keeps track of how many days have passed in Nosgoth since starting the game. This can make keeping track of specific saves somewhat difficult if you are playing through the game multiple times. While saving is self-explanatory, loading the game isn't immediately that. When you return to the game, you once more see the main menu where nothing has changed from the initial launch of the game. To continue from your save, you do not press start the game, since that restarts the game from the beginning. To actually load the game, you first need to go into the options menu, choose the load game option from the list, then browse to choose your save file. What I do not understand is, why didn't they add a load game button or even a continue game button to the main menu itself, instead of having to navigate to a sub-menu every time you return to the game and want to continue? It's not the most intuitive choice, but at least it's not that obscure either. The narration is a feature which I find absolutely brilliant as a storytelling device. On one hand, you're experiencing the journey of Kain in a linear fashion, learning new things as he does. But, on the other hand, you also have a clearly more experienced vampire Kain explaining things to you in more detail, slowly revealing to you more aspects of vampirism and also of himself. A great example of this happens as you finally leave the tutorial dungeon and enter the world of Nosgoth. Almost immediately you are faced with the assassins whose swords were the cause that ended your human existence. As your blade cuts down the assassins with ease, Kain's bloodthirsty and ecstatic narration revels in their deaths, clearly pleased that he was able to get his revenge. And so,
with my assassins dead, my quest was over.
Except, not quite. The necromancer Mortania speaks to you, explaining that these men were merely the tools of your assassination, but the one responsible for sending them is still at large. Ignoring this, Kain ponders the nature of his transformation. Is it a curse? Can he be cured? Having no answers to these questions, he decides that the next destination should be the Pillars of Nosgoth. Perhaps there you will find the answers he desires. After a short trek, you reach the Pillars where you're faced with a spirit who acts as your friendly neighborhood lore dump. She is called Ariel and explains that she was the guardian of balance in the Circle of Nine. The Circle of Nine is a group of people who've been chosen by the Pillars of Nosgoth, each of them representing a certain aspect of the universe. As long as the Guardians are alive and healthy of mind, the world will flourish, since the state of the world is directly linked to the state of the Pillars, which in turn are directly linked to the mental state of their Guardians. But now the Pillars have been corrupted by a traitorous act, the murder of Ariel, the loved one of another Guardian, that of the Pillar of the Mind, Napraptor. In his sorrow and madness, he spread this disease of the mind to the other remaining Guardians, and with this act, he has corrupted all of the Pillars. Ariel implores you to help her restore the balance to the Pillars and prevent the destruction of Nosgoth. Kain, however, does not care for the fate of the world, so Ariel instead implores him to think of himself, saying that only when balance has finally been restored to the Pillars will Kain's suffering be over. To cleanse the Pillars, each of the corrupted Guardians must perish and their totem returned to the Pillars. Only by doing this can the Pillars be restored and new Guardians be chosen to take over the responsibility of maintaining Nosgoth's prosperity. So, you embark on your quest. This marks the end of the tutorial and beginning of the overarching quest of the rest of the game. In a way, it is kind of interesting that the event that launches the entire story is partially resolved and then thrown into the background so early on in the game, with a new, completely disconnected quest taking over for the vast majority of the game. From this point onwards, the world as well is beginning to open, and one aspect of this is taught to you in the next screen. Immediately after teleporting, you find a large greenish pillar and a new tarot card. This is your first form card. Form cards allow Kain to transform into another vampiric form, which can perform specific actions no other forms can. The first one you acquire is the bat form, and is basically the fast travel action of the game. To unlock fast travel points, to which you can fly in the bat form, you must reach certain landmarks and activate markers in front of these greenish pillars. Once you've unlocked a location, you can use the transformation button to turn into the bat form and enter the map of Nosgoth. In the map, you can use the directional buttons to select your destination, up and down cycle between unlocked marker pillars, and left and right cycle between larger landmarks, and the exit button, which can be used to cancel the fast travel and return to the position where you transformed. Further down the road, you can find a building you can enter, where the floor of the antechamber is adorned with an image. At this point, you've found the first optional dungeon of the game. The image on the floor indicates which item or spell you'll receive from these chambers, and is a brilliant way of showing the player what they can expect when they delve deeper into the dungeon. Often you receive the new ability very early on in the dungeon, and the rest of the area is technically a small tutorial on how the new ability works. For example, this dungeon gives you the light spell, which allows you to illuminate your surroundings. To have the players naturally feel like they should use the spell and see how it works, the entire dungeon is very dark, and while it's very much completable without using the spell, the usage of it makes the process far less of a chore. This kind of design permeates the dungeons of the game, and in my opinion is a brilliant way to organically familiarize the player with the abilities they find. At the very least, it's a much better way than the more common style of having the player solve a dungeon that requires knowledge of previously acquired abilities, and when you reach the new ability, the dungeon is already over, and you may or may not be in a situation where the new ability is immediately useful. To actually use the spell, you must first equip it. This can be done from the inventory screen. The inventory screen is split into 3 categories: magical items, equipment, and spells. Items and spells must be set into quick select slots within the inventory screen before you can use them. Once done, you can then open the respective quick select window, choose the item or spell, and then it will be shown in your active magic slot in the user interface and can be used. To use the magic, all you need to do is press the magic button to activate the selected magic. If it is a spell, it drains some of your magic energy, and you can practically spam the spell as much as you want until you run out of it. If it is an item, you consume one per activation. All in all, the system feels very intuitive to use. Your magic energy replenishes slowly on its own, but can also be replenished by collecting magic orbs that are scattered around the dungeons. Continuing your trek through the wilderness of Nosgoth, you end up in a valley where the only way forward seems to be a cavern. Within the mountain, you receive the second vampiric form, the wolf transformation. This form acts as your primary means of terrain navigation for large portions of the game. In wolf form, Kain runs faster and, more importantly, can jump. Often, this is the only way to pass certain obstacles, including the ledges you saw outside the cavern from which the wolf form is received, or the dangerous pits of spikes which dominate the features of the tutorial dungeon. While using an active transformation, such as the wolf form, the game introduces yet another drawback which needs to be taken into account. As you are transformed, your magic energy drains slowly, especially in the early stages of the game when your maximum resource pools are very limited. This means you need to take into account how long you can remain transformed, and likely go back and forth between forms and only use a transformation when you really need it. Up until this point, the game has been very linear, and in many ways it will continue to be that, but receiving the wolf form opens up the game even more. With your newfound power of jumping, you can traverse up the cliffside and reach the next area, but before that you can explore even more with the help of another feature. The Eagle Eye View is an extremely important tool for those who wish to explore the world of Nosgoth more than where the main quest is leading you to. It is basically a map view of the current zone you're in, and can be freely scrolled around to see all the features of the area. Using this mode, it's possible to locate optional areas, such as new fast travel locations or hidden caverns, one of which is conveniently located in this area right after you've received the ability to traverse cliffs. In the cavern is the first Spirit Forge. This is basically the only system of trade you can engage in as a vampire. Humans aren't exactly happy to talk to you or trade with you, and even if they did, what would a vampire do with the tools of the mortals? Hence, the Spirit Forges can come in handy. In exchange for a decent amount of your blood, you can receive magical tools that can help you in your quest to slay the Guardians of the Pillars and bring back balance to Nosgoth. As seems to be the case with most things in the game, this exchange as well comes with heavy implications. Yes, it's nice to get more tools you can use to defeat your enemies, but blood is also your health pool and a precious resource. More resources for a heightened risk of death until you can acquire more blood. Placing this new form right before an area that is easily visible and contains something useful is a great way to teach the player that while the game is in many ways linear, exploring outside of this straightforward path can be very useful. Further down the road you find the village of Nachtholm, but are prevented from progressing by large boulders which are too heavy for Kain to push out of the way. Sure, you have the option of braving the deadly waters to enter the village, with a hefty price to your blood reserves, but there is another option. On the road to Nachtholm, the developers have placed a difficult-to-miss cavern atop a ledge. Exploring this cavern introduces one of the final large mechanics of the game, the blood fountains. These fountains act as a way to gain new passive abilities. Most of these take the form of improved strength, which allows Kain to push larger obstacles, and improved magic energy regeneration. Although there are a few unique passive abilities which aid in exploring certain areas.
The rain will do you no harm, for our blood preserves.
The one problem with this system is that I've not found a way to actually check what passive upgrades you've received, but in the grand scheme of things, this is a very minor issue. Traversing through the village highlights another aspect of your existence as a vampire. People do not trust you, and some even fear you. Some people seem to try and ignore you, perhaps believing you're just a sexy goth bad boy who smells good. Guardians and other brave souls go as far as to attack you on sight, transforming villages that for a human represent safety into a place where you're the one out of place and in danger. This change in the usual dynamic of fantasy villages in adventure games is quite fantastic. In games like Link to the Past, villages are a place to gather information, purchase useful resources, and destroy the property of villagers for personal gain. But now for a vampire, it is different. You can still destroy other people's stuff to gain resources, but the rest of the features of the villages have been changed. Walking into a town in the daytime is not necessarily safe, and at the very least it's pointlessly adding danger into your life. Whereas during the night while people are sleeping, you are the terror of the shadows, capable of feeding off sleeping villagers with little to no resistance. The game itself teaches about this change in how the player should think about villages quite brilliantly. When you reach Nachtholm, you really don't have any other choice but to travel through it. And even exploring the entire village will net you very little as a reward. Reaching the next village, on the other hand, gives you an option. Will you go through it, or will you take the mountain passage and go around it? However you decide to proceed, the path takes you to the same location, which leads into the village of Vassabund. Here, the dynamic changes once more. You've now been taught that as a vampire there's little to gain from villages, but in the outskirts of Vassabund is a gypsy camp, where Kain exclaims that some of them might have something important to say. But how? As a vampire you can't talk to people, and these travelers as well attack you on sight. Well, in one of the tents you find your third transformation, the human disguise. This form allows you to make the village experience more familiar to other adventure games. While transformed, you can walk amidst the humans without fear of being attacked, and by using the action button you can even talk to them and potentially receive important information about the world or your quest. Of course, this is not without its drawbacks. As mentioned before, being transformed slowly drains your magical energy, and while in the wolf form that may not have seemed important, now the drawback of using magic to maintain a transformation becomes more clear. After all, losing your transformation while being surrounded by human guards might lead to a very uncomfortable situation. In Vassabund, the game also railroads you into a specific direction with a pair of immovable monoliths, and thus the only direction remaining to you is towards the west, where the skull-shaped lair of Nupraptor lies behind hordes of armored guards. As you reach the cliffside entrance, you are given a choice of two caverns. One of them leads towards your goal, whereas the other leads to a short passage that gives you a nice view of Nupraptor's retreat. Going through this cavern forces you to return back through the same cavern, and might be the first moment when you notice another interesting feature of the game. Enemies in the game respawn when you re-enter an area, but sometimes they do not return alive. Instead, the ghosts of the foes you've slain begin to haunt the area. These transparent entities act identically to their living versions, but can sometimes be more difficult to see. Thankfully, they are also easier to kill, as they can withstand less damage than their alive counterparts. But ghosts have no blood. Not human blood anyway. This creates yet another difficulty you need to overcome in your vampiric existence. Killing humans gives you blood, and up until now, humans have been plentiful, and the dead have been replaced by new living humans. Knowing now that this is not always the case creates a dilemma in these dungeons. Yes, killing enemies will make the area easier, since even if backtracking, ghosts fall to your sword faster than living humans. But should you spare some for the blood, in case you need it? Ghosts are not entirely useless either. Even though their blood will not sustain the vampiric unlife, what ghost blood does is recover your magical energy. By slaying all enemies, you may lose some access to one resource, but you gain it to another. This also explains some aspects that may have remained unnoticed up until this point. Slashing enemies causes a spurt of pixelated blood to spill from them, and different enemy types have had different colored blood come out of them. Red for blood that heals, blue for blood that recovers magic. You can also encounter black and green blood, first of which causes direct damage and the latter poisons you, forcing you to be careful with your feeding to avoid bringing harm to yourself. Practically every aspect of the universe has some relevance to your vampiric existence, even if they are not immediately obvious when you first encounter them. But slowly, as you learn more about the world and also of yourself, more and more things begin to click in place and begin to be more meaningful. It is brilliant and, in my opinion, a testament to the amount of care and thought that was put into the game's world and how a vampire would survive and think in this world of Nosgoth. Braving the lair of Nupraptor, you see the consequences his madness has wrought on those close to him, and you get to see Kain slowly get used to his new existence.
The cretin squandered life and left it seeping on the floor. Such waste was a travesty. Perhaps Nupraptor needed to be taught a lesson as to the value of blood.
As you finally come face to face with the Mentalist, he's accompanied by Malek, the Guardian from the introduction who failed to protect the previous Circle of Nine. Nupraptor does not let him forget this fact and chases him away to face you alone. This leads to the first boss fight of the game, which isn't terribly difficult, a theme that continues for the rest of the game. In practice, you're fighting against the environment, walking from one side of the arena to the other, avoiding obstacles which increase as you strike Nupraptor. In many ways, this to me is reminiscent of the final battle of Ultima 2, where you have to go through Minax's castle between two chambers, and each time you strike her, she teleports to the other. You swiftly defeat the Guardian of the Mind and take his head as proof of your deed, but before you're able to leave the fortress, the game rewards you with your first new piece of equipment and a location where you need to use it to be able to leave. The mace is useful for two purposes. First, it allows you to stun enemies instead of killing them, making it easier to feed on your foes, which is extremely useful against armored enemies who can withstand a considerable amount of swings from your sword. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the mace can be used to break the monoliths that have been blocking several passages on your road here. To me, this is yet another brilliant way of immediately making it clear to the player what they can and should do with their newfound powers. Leaving the fortress, you automatically fly back to the Pillars of Nosgoth, where the first of the pillars has now been restored. This is a good sign, and Kain is pleased with his progress, dedicated now to the killing of the rest of the Circle to rid himself of this curse. Now, if any of this seems interesting so far, and you'd like to experience the story for yourself, this would be a great moment to pause the video and go play the game, since many things will happen from this point onwards, and I will spoil a significant amount of them. The remainder of your journey takes you through other areas of Nosgoth, one by one hunting your prey as you get more familiar with the world and meet more characters, including the recluse vampire Borodor, who was seen at the introduction.
Meddling with the affairs of man can do us no good. Seraphan witch hunts are much too tedious to concern ourselves with. Am I understood, Kain?
And an oracle who seems to have an unhealthy obsession with a certain king.
King Atmar, paralyzed by his princess's malaise. King Atmar the useless.
As you get further and further into the game, you also receive more equipment, including new pieces of armor. A nice detail about this is how each piece of equipment is actually shown in the character sprite, unlike many games where wearing a specific armor or wielding a weapon doesn't change the outward appearance of the playable character at all. Each piece of equipment has its own use, and it is up to the player to choose which gear to use based on their personal preferences. A flaming sword does more damage than a regular sword, but it also burns down your enemies, preventing you from being able to feed. Will you use an armor that has less protection but reflects the damage back to the enemy, or choose more protection? Practically everything about the equipment system is fantastic, even if it is, in a way, rather simple. Unfortunately, practically everything doesn't mean everything, since there is one massive issue that just gets more annoying the more gear you find. If you're the kind of player who wants to swap gear based on the situation you're in, such as switching to a mace to destroy all destroyable objects and then back to your sword to do damage, or perhaps you want to use the strong Soul Reaver Greatsword, which prevents you from using magic or items, but sometimes you want to cast spells so you need to switch to another weapon, then the issues with the gear system become very apparent. Every time you want to change a piece of equipment, you first need to open the menu, then navigate to the Equipment tab, open it and scroll to the piece of equipment you wish to wield, equip it, and then back down from the menus and continue playing. This is honestly very clunky and becomes annoying rather quickly, especially with older hardware or on the PlayStation where the loading times between the screens are unbearably long. For some reason, gear does not have a quick selection system like spells and items and forms do, forcing the player to do this every single time. A simple way to fix this would have been to just allow the player to bind equipment to quick slots as you do with everything else, but instead the last shoulder button where the quick slots are located is saved for a zoom function, which on the PC at least is practically useless. As you travel further into Nosgoth, you begin to hear tidings of war. A kingdom to the north led by their fierce king Nemesis is gathering his forces to invade Nosgoth. This creates another problem, since the fury of Nemesis is legendary and his forces leave behind little else than ashes. Even if you were able to restore the pillars and cure your curse, living under the rule of Nemesis is not a life Kain finds appealing. So, you take part in this war. You fight through hordes of warriors, but to no avail. The forces of Nosgoth fall under the overwhelming power of the northern hordes, and all seems lost, until something strange happens. An object you recovered from one of your prey begins to tremble, and the world around you changes. Up until this point, the story of the game has seemed pretty straightforward, and what you needed to do has been clear. Hunt down the 9 guardians of the Pillars of Nosgoth and be cured from your vampirism. Now things are about to get complicated. The device you held was a time-streaming device, and you've been transported 50 years into the past. Here you find not only an opportunity to change the fate of Nosgoth, but also one of your prey, the time streamer Mobius, who is supplying William the Just, the future nemesis, with weapons to destroy his enemies, while stoking a fear of vampires in the population. To prevent the hordes of Nemesis from waging their war of destruction, Kain decides the best way to deal with the situation is to kill him before he has an opportunity to begin his campaign of terror. The king falls quickly to your blade, and you find another time-streaming device, which transports you back into the present time. In your own time, the castle of Nemesis now lies in disrepair, his army is disbanded, and the kingdom fallen. By this change in time, Nosgoth is saved. However, not all is as expected, and quickly the reality of the situation is revealed. Your actions may have saved Nosgoth, but they also doomed the vampire population. The murder of a beloved king before his fall into insanity by a vampire bred a violent rage in the population, and a new crusade against the vampires was born. Witnessing the execution of Vorador, you realize it was Mobius who orchestrated these events, and you played straight into his hands. You are now the only remaining vampire in all of Nosgoth, and with your death, his plan will finally be complete. However, despite his ability to see the future, he can still misinterpret things.
The future says you die.
But I am dead. As are you.
With most of the circle now dead, you return to the pillars where your final quarries await. Mortanius the Necromancer does half of your job for you by killing another member of the circle, explaining that the corruption of the pillars caused the circle to fail, and he orchestrated your death and resurrection so the circle could be killed and the pillars healed. With that revelation, he says he resigns to his fate, but still fights you. The final battle is once more not terribly difficult, especially with all the spells and gear you have accumulated by this point. And as Mortanius falls, he transforms into a being that taunts you, saying that his plan is almost complete and you've once more been a pawn. This leads to the second phase of the fight, which is, honestly, pretty anticlimactic. What comes next, however, is not. It is revealed that you are the final guardian, chosen on the day of Ariel's murder, and it is your duty to bring balance back to the pillars, and thus you are given a choice. Sacrifice yourself to restore the pillar of balance, or refuse the sacrifice and doom Nosgoth into a slow but certain decline. Obviously, the sacrifice option is the correct one, and the game has a happy ending while you feel like an accomplished hero. Blood Omen Legacy of Kain is, simply put, fantastic. Yes, it's very much inspired by games such as the Legend of Zelda series in how the gameplay progression is structured and also in how many aspects of the gameplay itself function. But that's for a good reason. More often than not, those games are very solid experiences. Of course, this game is not perfect. Once you accumulate enough resources, the combat becomes more of a chore than something enjoyable, and it in fact becomes easy to just ignore that aspect of the game almost completely. Especially once you receive a spell that negates almost all damage you can receive. That, combined with an armor that reflects damage, makes combat lack any kind of threat, and no threat, to me, equals no real enjoyment. Still, the way the combat and equipment progression has been structured, it is very interesting up until a point. The exploration aspects of the game are much more interesting, and several areas feel like little puzzles. Sure, they are simple puzzles, but juggling between different forms and spells to explore areas is still a fun thing to do, especially since there are plenty of things to find if you do decide to explore more than what is expected. The weakest part of this is that not a lot of optional exploration will net you anything that special, and most of what you find are more consumables or ways to get more consumables via the Spirit Forges. There are even points where the game forces you to explore more by barring your path with boulders you can only pass with a strength upgrade further down an alternate path. In my opinion, it would be more interesting if more of these upgrades would be optional, as that would make them feel like a reward for going past a linear path, instead of just being something the game guides you towards since you need it to progress. Where the game really shines is the story. Kain is a fantastic anti-hero who's just thrust into this situation because of his ego, which is what the masterminds behind the largest schemes of the game took advantage of. Mortanius knew that Kain would more than likely take advantage of an opportunity to gain revenge for his death without thinking about the consequences of his actions, and he was correct. Only after the slaying of the assassins does Kain properly begin to realize what he's done, and for a while clearly regrets his decision. For a while being the key phrase here, since his growth as a character is absolutely fantastic. As you play through the game, Kain's narration slowly becomes more and more comfortable with the idea of him being a vampire, and he begins to see his situation less as a curse, and clearly begins to think like a vampire instead of a human.
Gift? Vorador thought my curse a blessing. That we were gods.
I make no pretense to justify my killing, yet these vampire hunters would cloak their bloodlust beneath a veil of righteousness. Hypocrites! They would make themselves judge and jury. Very well then. Let us see how they take to my role as executioner.
The change in his attitude is brilliantly done, and Kain's transformation from a follower of orders into a person comfortable with his vampirism and capable of choosing his own path is one of the best parts of the game that to me has made this game such a classic. Most other characters you don't get to know nearly as well. Vorador the Vampire seems like a major figure based on the intro of the game, but in the end he's just another side character. An old vampire who just wants to live in his mansion and enjoy a decadent lifestyle filled with blood. And that's about it. Even other major players of the plot get relatively little time to grow. Mobius the Time Streamer, who in the lore of the game is the cause of a major war threatening the land, only appears in the game a couple of times, including as his alter ego, the Oracle, guiding you towards the war so he can goad you into murdering William the Just and creating a new timeline where he's the leader of a group of vampire hunters. It would have been interesting to know more about his hatred of vampires and why he's so willing to go to these lengths to rid the world of all of Kain's kin, but alas, we never find that out in this game. Then we have Mortanius the Necromancer, who gets all of his character development at the very end of the game, after appearing shortly at the beginning and then mostly disappearing from the game. The ending as well is rather confusing, since in the cutscene Mortanius is willing to be slain to heal the pillars, but immediately after saying that, he fights you. His transformation into a monstrosity as well is not properly explained, and it seems like he has conflicting motivations. On one hand, he says he wants the pillars to be healed and you to kill him, but then in his monstrous form he has completely different motivations which are not properly explained, but they do revolve around the pillars being corrupted. In part, this is because this segment of the story was apparently changed rather late in development, resulting in a somewhat confusing scene if you miss a secret area and one line by Ariel, and then manage to put all the pieces together. In fact, this monstrosity is not Mortanius, but the unspoken of which Ariel warns you of with a throwaway line. Even though it's not properly explained, we can then assume Mortanius is somehow possessed by this entity, and his death allowed the being to manifest in reality and attempt to finally stop you. This is the one part of the story that I find to be rather weak. But for the most part, the little glimpses we get into the stories of the characters are interesting and enhance the feeling of the world being a collection of twisted fairy tales. So, overall, the writing is superb. Especially when it comes to the world of Nosgoth itself, as every area you wander into can give you more information about the world, whether with the dialogue from Kain or the inhabitants of the villages who talk about the war, a plague ravaging the land, vampire attacks and so on. Slowly telling you more about the world, and sometimes showing these things to you with environmental storytelling. This ties into the well-executed audio-visual presentation of the game. This is an early PlayStation era game, and instead of experimenting with 3D, the developers chose to create a 2D game instead, which was probably a good idea. The sprite work is, for the most part, good-looking, and conveys the feeling of a medieval world that is slowly dying. The music of the game is very atmospheric, but there is one issue with the music system that is a little bit jarring. Whenever you pause the game, whether it's to go to your inventory or by opening one of your quick select windows to change spells or items, the audio pauses abruptly, and after leaving said menu, the audio resumes just as abruptly. This is overall not the best way they could have done things, but in the grand scheme of things, it is a rather minor complaint. Overall, in case it's not already blatantly obvious, I love this game. Absolutely love it. And if you're like me and want more good games with vampires, and you haven't yet played this, do so. Seriously. It's great. Anyway, that is it for this time, and next time we'll be looking at the sequel, Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver, where I'm sure the world is completely healed and we're all praising the sacrifice of Kain, which is his legacy. Thanks to all the Ko-fi and Patreon supporters, Iliad Drone, The Bloke, High Food Court, Zai, and Daniel Zupke. You're all amazing, and until next time, Fintrovert, signing out.